Good afternoon, everyone, and namaskar. So today we are having an important topic for discussion, that is taming food inflation in a flexible inflation targeting regime. Lessons from promising practices. Uh, Let me tell you the context. I am sure actually most of you are aware that RBI is now following basically inflation targeting. RBI has been given a target of 4 plus and minus 2%, and that target is basically focused on the headline inflation, not the core inflation. Now, but the economic survey of India has now basically suggested that we should focus on the core inflation, and that's how you could see a lot of discussions in the newspaper and different forums. Actually, we see such discussions. So today, okay, so this meeting will be presided by Professor Rabinaran Patra, the president of Odisha Economic Association. He is sitting with me, and we have got a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Sitikantha Patnaik, who is currently the chief economist of NABARD and is the former executive director of the Reserve Bank of India. And he has worked as a key person in the secretariat to the expert committee to revise and strengthen the monetary policy framework of India in 2013, which recommended the adoption of this flexible inflation targeting in India. He was also a co-author of the report on currency and finance with the theme Reviewing the Monetary Policy Framework, which had recommended to retain the same targets before the scheduled official reset of the inflation target on March 31st, 2021. For the next 5 years, that is from 2021 to 2026 March. During both occasions, the issue of the headline versus core inflation as the target under FIT must have been discussed in great detail. And during the discussion today, he may cover some of those insights. And again, before I again invite the president of Odisha Economic Association to speak a few words, I should also thank Dr. Silu Muduli, actually, who is for basically facilitating connection with Dr. Sitikant Patnaik. And I should also thank Dr. Patnaik, who quickly agreed actually to deliver this talk, and in a very short notice, I would say. So I'd like to thank Dr. Sitikant Patnaik for accepting our invitation, and I really look forward to an enlightening lecture. I'm sure the participants, actually, I think many of our teachers in colleges and universities, and we teach monetary policy, the role of monetary policy in controlling inflation. So this will be directly helpful for many of them in their teaching. So I also look forward to getting a lot of questions from our participants so that we have a very good discussion. Now, with that note, let me invite the president of Odisha Economic Association, Professor Rabinaran Patra, to give the introductory remarks. Over to
you. Friends, namaskar. I don't want to be a roadblock between Dr. Naik and you all on a very insightful topic, that is inflation. We all know that inflation is a major problem in India, and the most disturbing part is that a large contributor to overall inflation is food inflation. So that troubles everybody, particularly the people in the rural areas who spend a large part of their income on food articles, food items. So with that in mind, we planned to have a lecture on this inflation targeting, how monetary policy plays a role in it, and specifically it will be useful to the students, particularly the paper on monetary economics, inflation and all that specifically. So with that in mind, we planned a lecture. We requested a Silu, and Silu has been very kind enough to facilitate this say link between Odisha Economics Association and Dr. Sitikanta Patnaik. Sitikanta Patnaik is known to the elder generation. He passed from Revensa, and he has created a name for himself in the Reserve Bank, particularly in policy making. So we are very happy that Dr. Patnaik has agreed to deliver the lecture, and I am very much thankful to him and to you all for having spared this afternoon after lunch, post lunch afternoon for this lecture. Thank you all.
Okay. So thank you so much, sir. Now, without any further delay, I now invite the speaker of this afternoon, Dr. Sitikant Patnaik, to deliver his address. Over to you, sir.
Namaskar and good afternoon to all. Thank you, Dr. Patra, Dr. Das, and all the members of the Odia Economic Association for organizing this discussion on a very important topic and having me here to lead the discussion. I can only lead the discussion because I am sure each one of you will have your views on this topic. And as Dr. Das mentioned, this is not a new topic. It was debated before the adoption of inflation targeting in India. It was debated actually in great detail by the expert committee when the inflation targeting framework was recommended, and subsequently also when it was adopted. Then after 5 years, the target itself became due, but that was the post-COVID period. So the Reserve Bank of India worked on a report on currency and finance, and the next review will be in 2026 March. But much before that, this time the debate has resurfaced. So I'll start with the reasons. What is the context? Why we are debating this topic again? And I can see many of my seniors like Dr. Bhoi, Dr. Das, Dr. Malik, and many of my colleagues also worked with me. They have also joined. So I'm sure they will be having their views. Maybe during the question and answer session, possibly we'll reflect further on some of the points that we'll make during a presentation I have. So now I'm sharing the presentation.
Yes, please.
Some of the colleagues who have worked in Reserve Bank of India, they will immediately find two faults with the title of the presentation, because inflation is always a concept which is used when we talk of headline inflation. So technically, one should be talking about food price inflation. But we also know that one important aspect of monetary policy is communication, which should be simple. So I think in non-technical discussions, I think use of the term food inflation is okay. But even though in technical discussions, it should be always food price inflation. And some of the participants also who may be very strong supporters of inflation targeting, they will find also fault with why I'm writing promising practices, why I'm not using the best practices. Because as we know, the flexible inflation targeting framework is both a science and an art. So the science part essentially is the rule, and the art part is essentially the flexibility in FIT. And even after COVID, even after the recent war, what is very clear is that the science part of it, in terms of the framework, I think it is not being questioned anywhere. So the debate is essentially about the flexibility part. That means whatever happened because of supply shocks. So whether it's interpretation and whether the manner in which monetary policy responded to that globally, that is an issue which must be debated. And I must mention here that whatever I am presenting here, they reflect my personal views and not the views of NABARD. So what is the context? If you see the left-hand side chart, the blue line, which is the core inflation, that is inflation excluding food and fuel, has dropped below 4% since December. It has remained below 4% since December. But food inflation remained high for a pretty long period. I have used data only since July 2023 here. And if you see the last 2 months, food inflation also has dropped below the 6% upper tolerance band. And the headline inflation also has dropped to 3.7, which is below 4% target. But we must recognize that this decline must be seen in the context of the high base, because we had in the month of July and August higher inflation in food and also higher headline inflation. So once we adjust for that base effect, then the interpretation of what is happening to inflation dynamics could be very different. And the second aspect, which possibly is explained in the right-hand side part of this slide, is a box which came in the economic survey, that there are too many interventions now in the um, farm produce market, starting from wheat, rice, pulses, onion, edible oils, and as a result of which, what is happening, we are not allowing farmers to benefit from higher prices. And it was mentioned in the context of a farmer-friendly policy framework which is required, and how do we let the markets function in the interest of the farmers. So this is essentially the context in terms of the facts, but in terms of exact nature of the debate, if I quote economic survey of July 22nd, so it says that when food prices rise, inflation targets come under threat. Therefore, the central bank appeals to the government to bring down the increase in the prices of food products. That prevents farmers from benefiting from the rise in terms of trade in their favor. So the first argument is in terms of trade. So we'll see in the next slide what has happened to the terms of trade in India. And India's inflation targeting framework should consider targeting inflation excluding food. That is the essence of what we are debating today. And the third part also, which I have taken from economic survey, is that short-term monetary policy tools are meant to counteract price pressures arising out of excess aggregate demand growth. So we'll see whether food inflation is essentially an outcome of only supply shock, or demand conditions also have some role in influencing the food inflation trajectory. So what happened subsequently in the monthly bulletin of August, excuse me, a seemingly counter view appeared without referring to the economic survey. It argued that monetary policy is the only active disinflationary agent in the economy. So we'll examine maybe during the course of the discussion whether inflation is a monetary phenomenon, no matter what may be the source of the inflation. Food price shocks have imposed upside pressures on core inflation, which has been offset by disinflationary monetary policy. So what argument here, I think if I elaborate, that because of increase in food prices, there is spillover to core inflation. And because that monetary policy was tightened, it is essentially countering the inflationary impact of food prices on headline inflation. Failing to act against persistent food inflation risks expectations getting unanchored, generalization of price pressures, and loss of control over inflation. Thereafter, what we saw is another article from Dr. Nageshwaran, 3rd September in the Mint it was published. The title was Inflation Targeting, It is Not Set in Stone and Needs a Critical Review. It was essentially a 7-point fault lines in the inflation targeting framework of India. And subsequently, in the Business Line of August 29th, he again talked about crops and agri trade impacting earnings of farmers. More recently, TCS Srinivas Raghavan wrote a piece titled Who Needs Inflation Targeting? So there he concluded by asking these questions. Should we repeal the 2016 law? Should we ignore it? Should we amend it? If so, how? That's what needs a good debate. And we all have joined here to debate this particular issue. So let us start with the terms of trade. That's the main argument in the economic survey. So what has happened to terms of trade? The terms of trade is essentially the price of food vis-a-vis non-food, or maybe we can say agri vis-a-vis manufacturing and services prices. So if you take the long time period which is available, both from RBI Handbook of Statistics, then this is agriculture to manufacturing, agriculture to services, and agriculture to non-agriculture. So there is no evidence of actually the terms of trade moving against the farmers. If we use other indicators instead of price deflators taken from GVA data, WPI and CPI, so red lines are essentially food index or primary articles index, and the index value of pulses, vegetables, onion, potato, or in this case spices and vegetables for CPI, vis-a-vis 2011-12 is equal to 100 as the base for WPI, and 2012 as equal to 100 as the base for CPI price indices. So what you find here is, in case of CPI, the general price index has increased up to 193, as against that food index has gone up to 202. And if we take core index, the core index is 186. So if we use the measure of CPI, here also we don't find any evidence of terms of trade moving against food. And it is coming out even more clearly when we use WPI as the measure. So before we uh, come to the key issues in the discussion, let us refer to research based on 100 inflation shocks. So what is the um, insight we get from this particular research, which essentially is about what happens to inflation if you tolerate inflation too much in the process of accommodating supply shocks. So what it says is that out of the 100 major inflation episodes since the oil price shock of 1970s, uh, only 10% of the inflation pressure is managed within 1 year, and over a 5 year period, the inflation is managed. Maybe 50% of the inflation shocks, or a little more than 50% of the inflation episodes, have been managed within 5 years. So it essentially is about how long inflation, how long monetary policy may take to bring inflation down, and what could be the consequences of whether you are bringing inflation down faster or you are delaying the process. And from this research, it shows that actually close to 50% of the inflation episodes were not resolved within 5 years. And what are the consequences? So the first lesson when we debate the issue of food inflation, core inflation, and monetary policy taken together, generally whenever you celebrate in a premature manner that yes, inflation has come down, you get the shock because inflation goes up again. This was particularly seen during the 1970s um, experience of managing inflation in many countries. Only few countries I have presented here. And the most important finding of this research is that if you leave inflation unresolved, then what happens is that you sacrifice much less growth in the first 2 years. And if you resolve it in the 2 year time frame, then what happens? The growth sacrifice is certainly more. But if you don't do anything, then in the long run, in the 5 year time horizon, you find that if inflation is not resolved, the growth sacrifice is much more. So the issue here is inflation, whatever may be the source, if you don't manage it, then the long run growth sacrifice will be much more. And that is one of the common understanding that drives inflation targeting framework, that not only you need a sound framework, but you be clear that if you don't manage inflation timely and you feel that it is a supply shock, so it should be tolerated for long, then actually you end up with a situation where inflation is much higher and growth is much weaker, because you tolerated that supply shock, hoping that you will be sacrificing growth much less. But what happens in reality is that you sacrifice growth much more, and your inflation also remains higher. So if I go back to the previous slide, how generally the issue of terms of trade seen in the context of inflation management, because terms of trade as a concept was essentially being debated when we had the planning era. It was essentially about resource allocation. And once we have a market economy, it is essentially the market forces which decide how they should be responding to relative price shocks. And the key argument here is that if agricultural output prices have remained higher than manufacturing prices and services prices, then the resource allocation mechanism possibly is not working well. Because ideally, in a relative price shock, which is a real sector shock, it is not a monetary shock, uh, resources should have moved to agriculture to improve supply response. But there could be two possibilities, because there are too many interventions in the agriculture sector, particularly in the product market, not happening essentially in the price sector. And second thing, if this is a particular pattern which persists, it is a structural feature which requires a structural response. And when I come to how fiscal policy and financial sector policy should be uh, responding to this type of shocks by providing incentives and disincentives, the mix of both, to ensure that adequate resource allocation happens, because of which this type of pattern, what we see, red bars clearly overshooting the green bars and the black bars, that does not happen. But what we are debating here, that instead of the debate focusing on how to ensure that resource reallocation in response to relative price shocks, the discussion is mostly on how monetary policy should be responding to these relative price shocks. And that is why I'll be devoting some bit of time, maybe 3 slides. It may look little technical, but they're not technical, where I know everybody here understands economic arguments very well, and each one of you might have used those arguments or similar charts to, uh, to justify your viewpoint. So I'm asking you 3 questions. Is persistent food price inflation a monetary phenomenon in the medium run? So I would argue that yes. Whatever may be the source of inflation, ultimately it is a monetary phenomenon. If FIT more suitable framework to deal with food price supply shocks induced inflation, when I say FIT, that means inflation targeting among alternative monetary policy regimes which are available. So here again, I'll try to justify that the answer is yes. The third question will be, is it possible to strengthen the FIT framework in future when it is maybe due for a review before March 2026? So I'll say yes. If we see the literature, and particularly the literature in the post COVID period, both emerging market economies and advanced economies, then there is clearly scope for revisiting the flexibility part of the framework. So what have been the three I think major insights, if we see as quotes from 3 former governors, Dr. Rangarajan, if we see in 2020, I have mentioned all the references here down. Monetary policy must act irrespective of what triggered inflation. So here also it is very clear that whatever may be the source of inflation, monetary policy must act. In a situation of supply shocks, it may take longer for monetary policy to bring inflation down. So we'll see in the subsequent slides why monetary policy deliberately responds in a very different way to supply shocks vis-a-vis demand shocks. And in the process of responding very differently to supply shocks, why it takes little longer to bring inflation down. Quoting Dr. Rajan, some argue rightly that it is hard for RBI to directly control food demand through monetary policy. Then they proceed incorrectly to say we should not bother about controlling CPI inflation. To prevent sustained food inflation from becoming generalized inflation, we have to reduce inflation in other items. So the argument here is that if food inflation is not directly sensitive to monetary policy shocks, then one way to reduce inflation is certainly by reducing the core part of the inflation. So we'll see when we go to actual facts, then how exactly we could interpret this particular aspect. And before the adoption of the flexible inflation targeting framework, Dr. Subarao, who had delivered a speech on challenge of food inflation, he had mentioned that the binary textbook prescriptions, monetary policy as the first line of defense, because some would argue that monetary policy must respond, whatever may be the source of supply, versus complete hands off, what maybe some are arguing now that monetary policy has no role in managing food inflation. This type of binary interpretation underestimate underestimate the complexity of the policy challenge in practice. So I'll try to use more recent facts and more recent research to maybe expand some of these aspects which are highlighted by the former three governors of RBI. So what is the debate? The debate is essentially about a relative price shock. And we all know what Milton Friedman had said in 1975. Why should the average level of all prices be affected significantly by changes in the prices of some things relative to others? If prices of food increase relative to prices of manufactured products, why should headline inflation increase? The argument was that if the price index, price level, is a weighted combination of food and non-food, so this will increase only when money supply increases. Without any increase in money supply, take for example, each one of us may be having suppose 100 rupees as the income. We are spending 50 on food and 50 on non-food. Suddenly, because of supply shock, we are spending rupees 60 out of 100 on food. We are left with only 40. So, if we are left with 40, necessarily the contribution of the core part to headline inflation will go down and headline inflation will not increase. This was the core argument of Milton Friedman. But what we got subsequently, plenty of very good both theoretical and empirical research, that these relative price changes actually act as aggregate supply shocks. It is not that they remain confined only to food. So it can actually give rise to a generalized price pressures. So Lawrence Ball, the argument through menu cost, then downward price flexibility, Fisher and Frankel. So all these, I think those who are following monetary policy literature, they would know that relative price shocks are actually, in practice, aggregate supply shocks. So then the issue is, if it is an aggregate supply shock, and that's why this P goes up, unlike what Milton Friedman had argued that P will not go up, if P actually goes up in practice, then why monetary policy does not stabilize such price pressures? This is the key issue which we are debating. So what this particular nice article argues is that monetary policy accommodates by choice to lower growth sacrifice in the short run. That means it is a deliberate choice exercised by monetary policy to not sacrifice too much of growth, because when you get an adverse supply shock, it is a relative price shock, but it works like an aggregate supply shock, as a result of which you are in any case going to get higher inflation and lower growth. So if you respond by using monetary policy, you may actually sacrifice more growth, even though in the very short run, unless and until you know whether the food inflation is spilling over to core, it may not be appropriate to respond to such price pressures. And the second argument, which also some are highlighting in the recent debate, that monetary policy is not the effective tool to counter such price pressures. We'll see whether monetary policy is the right instrument, certainly to deal with the second round effects of food price pressures. So now how the debate has moved from here, it is little theoretical but very important to understand in practice, that much of the argument earlier was when money was used as exogenously managed by the central bank. That means central bank will inject excess money into the system, and that's why you will get higher food inflation. But as we know, central banks are conducting their monetary policy by using the interest rate, and because of which money growth is essentially endogenous. So this is a very nice article which explains this particular aspect. It talks about demand for money accommodation and supply of monetary accommodation. So what is demand for monetary accommodation? Because when we talk of inflation rising, if we are buying maybe the same food items paying higher prices, then the demand for money automatically goes up. So the demand for monetary accommodation is created by domestic demand shifts, domestic cost push, and supply shocks from abroad, which could be maybe commodity price shocks or even external development because of which exchange rate may come under pressure. So all these things actually may increase the demand for money in the system. Then what is left at the discretion of the central bank is to how much it would supply. So the debate earlier was that the central bank is supplying excess money and that is causing higher inflation. But now the argument is that the framework is now endogenous. The monetary accommodation process is an endogenous process. So exogenously created excess money is not the culprit here. Endogenous monetary accommodation of inflation induced demand for money to keep the weighted average call rate closer to the policy repo rate and avoid overshooting of the weighted average call rate as per the current operating framework of monetary policy is what makes supply shock led inflation a monetary policy phenomenon. I think in the interest of time, I will not be able to expand further on this, but those of you who have interest in really understanding why, whatever may be the nature of shock that gives us inflation, in the medium run, it is a monetary phenomenon, maybe you could refer to some of this literature. So in terms of hard facts, how it operates, so I have taken here on the left-hand side the food demand and supply, how they interact, and the right-hand side how the demand and supply for non-food interact. So you get a relative price shock. Because of the relative price shock, your supply curve shifts to the left, your prices of food increase, and there is some bit of contraction in output. So if you believe in the Friedman's view that if this price is going up, the price of non-food must go down, P1B. Why? Because you are not left with more purchasing power to buy more non-food items. So that is why this adjustment will automatically happen. But as I explained in practice, and also there are reasons, pure economic reasons, why this will not happen, and this is not also happening. So this food shock will essentially for the economy will work as an aggregate supply shock. And when an aggregate supply shock happens, the choice here is to um, how to respond to inflation going up. And if monetary policy accommodates, because the idea is that if the growth sacrifice should not happen, then maybe inflation will increase further. How it happens? If we take the monetary policy operating framework, as most of you know, we have the monetary policy framework, which is the inflation target and the upper tolerance band and the lower tolerance band. And we also have the implementation framework. That means once the MPC decides what is the repo rate, which is 6.5, then how on a day-to-day basis, the weighted average call rate must be kept very close to the policy repo rate. This is taken from the last RBI bulletin. So what it shows is that the weighted average call rate on a daily basis moves very close to the repo rate between the repo rate and the MSF rate recently. And generally, end March, we get liquidity pressures, and that is the time. Not only this year, every year there is some bit of the pressures because of which the weighted average call rate goes above the MSF rate. So what is the argument here? If we see the left-hand side in terms of the operating framework, If we are operating with a monetary policy operating framework where the interest rate anchors the implementation of monetary policy, then the idea is that unless and until MPC changes the repo rate, everyday monetary policy implementation has to happen as per this. So assume that because of any shock in the system, as I explained in the previous slide, suppose the demand for liquidity goes up, because that the weighted average fall rate has to be kept very close to I star, so you will accommodate. So earlier you were providing primary liquidity, which is base money, which was R1, it will go up automatically to R2. So this is what is known as the endogenous monetary accommodation, because the framework itself allows the central bank to endogenously accommodate whatever is the increase in demand for liquidity. Because if you don't accommodate this increase in demand for liquidity from R1 to R2, this weighted average call rate will immediately go above the marginal standing facility rate. So we have a framework which tells us that whatever may be the nature of shock, monetary policy must accommodate. So whether it is accommodating or not, it depends essentially on how the MPC responds to different supply shocks, whether by maintaining the interest rate at I star or raising the interest rate to maybe I1, I2, or I3. So if we see in terms of literature how monetary policy responds to supply shocks, suppose it is just one-time shock, then what happens? Inflation goes up. It is taken from one article for ECB, the ECB forum. So the inflation target 2% suppose deviates and goes up to 6% because it is just one-time food price shock. We know that this food price shock is one time, so inflation will increase from 2% to 6%. It will remain at 6% for 12 months because inflation is a year-on-year concept. So exactly after 12 months, inflation will drop down to 2%. So here the assumption is that there is no transmission from food inflation to headline inflation. So the headline inflation only responds to one-time shock in food inflation, and then after 12 months it goes back to 2%. So monetary policy need not respond here. But if monetary policy responds here and tries to bring inflation back to 2% within 6 months, within 4 months, within 3 months, then what happens? This becomes the path of inflation. Inflation falls drastically because you aggressively raise interest rate, but the nature of the supply shock has been very transitory, as a result of which inflation not only goes back to 2%, you actually deliver a deflation in the system. And this is the type of monetary policy accommodation which is warranted. That means don't respond to this type of shock, because if you respond by trying to bring inflation closer to the target within less than 12 months, what you end up actually is by having deflation and massive sacrifice of output. In practice, what happens that some of this increase in inflation, which is induced by food shock, it spills over to core inflation, as a result of which inflation doesn't come back to 2% after 1 year. Maybe it comes down, but it comes down to maybe 4%. And it takes much longer, maybe 24 months, to go down to 20, go down to 2%. This is just a hypothetical example, but I'll show you subsequently that this path is not necessarily 2 years. It could be 3 years, it could be 4 years. And one of the slides also I showed that depending on the inflation dynamics in different countries, it may take even up to 5 years. If you don't respond to such shocks and allow food shocks to spill over to headline inflation, then it may take much longer. So, what then monetary policy should do in such a situation? It must respond. When it responds, what happens? It it essentially delivers an inflation path which is superior to an inflation path which you will get when monetary policy is not responding. And this yellow dotted line is the path which actually monetary policy delivers. And using actual literature for India, I will also show that how this path has behaved in the post-COVID period. This is another interesting literature. This is Ben Bernanke and Olivier Blanchard. They examined essentially how central banks of 11 advanced economies respond to three shocks: the energy price shock, the food price shock, and the shortages. Because post Ukraine phase, many of the countries, because of supply chain disruptions, faced shortages. And the initial problem with interpretation of inflation dynamics for most of the central banks was whether inflation is transitory, that means the shocks are transitory or they're more permanent. So now that they have used hard data for 11 countries, I have presented for 10 here, and Canada also exactly the similar pattern. So what they find is that usually supply shocks, when you assume that they will dissipate within 1 year, that's not the case because this time we had overlapping supply shocks. But now what we find is that for every country, if we take all three shocks taken together, within 5 to 6 quarters, these supply shocks have dissipated. So this clearly tells that if you accommodate some of these supply shocks and don't respond aggressively, then inflation may take much longer because if earlier some supply shock was taking maybe X number of quarters for inflation to come back to the target, this time it might have taken little longer. And this is here actually the flexibility part in terms of inflation forecasting, understanding the nature of the inflation shock and how long it will persist and how over what time frame it will impact core inflation. That assessment, I think, is an issue. When I come to the last slide, that has become a major area of debate now in the post-COVID period. Now that this type of research experience is available, how exactly that flexibility should be used when we are conducting monetary policy using FIT regime. So what they find here is that unlike the 1970s oil price shock, when I think it took almost 8 9 years, and we had the Volcker response to that inflation. We delivered two recessions. Why this time the experience has been very different? Despite aggressive tightening by some of the advanced economies, there is no evidence of recession. And why these supply shocks have dissipated so fast, unlike in the 1970s? So what they conclude is that the post-pandemic inflation episode stands in sharp contrast to the persistent effects of relative price shocks in the 1970s. The more transient effects of price shocks this time around are traced in large part in the model. They have proposed a new model for all central banks. So in that model, so what they ascribe it is to more anchored inflation expectations. So because that inflation expectations are anchored better, so you are getting a very different result this time compared to 1970s. And the limited catch up of real wages because the wage bargaining power of labor has come down drastically globally. So the first is likely due to higher credibility of monetary policy. That means FIT as a framework, I think one could conclude, is responsible for the better anchoring of inflation expectations. That is why despite um, several supply shocks, I think in an overlapping manner, hitting the economies and impacting the price trajectories, over 6 to 7 quarters, actually the price pressures have dissipated. And the second one is the disappearance of wage indexation because labor unions are not very strong in most of the advanced economies. As a result of which, even though supply price pressure induced inflation increase, uh, uh, not much. The wages are not debated also in the monetary policy setting because the left-hand side chart it is taken from research in terms of the U.S. Monetary Policy Committee voting pattern since 1957. So whenever the inflation path is influenced by supply shocks, generally the differences are much larger in case of supply shocks compared to demand shocks. In case of a demand shock, there is general agreement among the MPC members, but this is for the US. And the differences in case of supply shock is particularly more when it is the inflation is on the rising trajectory. The right-hand side chart shows that whenever we face inflation shocks, there is greater uncertainty also in the financial markets because The 3 month ahead treasury bill interest rate, that means the forecast for current quarter, next quarter, and 2 quarters ahead, the errors are much larger. And this is also one of the reasons why we find that the financial market analysts, they closely monitor monetary policy and much of the writings. Instead of focusing on the real sector of the economy, there's so much of attention which is essentially given to what monetary policy will do, because they have investment positions, and because of this uncertainty, because the inability to predict what may happen to the trajectory of short-term interest rate, that um, that explains why there is such a huge attention paid by the financial market analysts to monetary policy cycles and expectations about what monetary policy may do. So coming to India, if we see over time what has happened to the share of food, it is dropping at a very slow pace. So I'm highlighting here two specific aspects of in India's interpretation of flexibility in the FIT. The left-hand side part of this chart shows in the rural areas, and the right-hand side part of this chart is for urban areas. So what is the share of food? For example, if we see for rural areas over a period of almost 11 years, between 2011-12 and 2022-23, the weight has declined from 52.9 to 46.38. So the weight of food is declining at less than 1 percentage point per year, which tells us that even maybe after 10 years, the share of food will possibly remain much above 30%. And this is a phenomenon which is not going to leave us. And that's why the debate is likely to continue even in the next 10 years, next 20 years maybe. And another important aspect which need to understand that much of the food side price pressures which get highlighted in the newspapers is coming from vegetables. So earlier there was a clear pattern that um, the vegetable prices will soften during winter. Then again, starting April, the increase will start. They will peak around maybe August and September. And then recent month, we had unseasonal rains in October and November that disrupted the pattern. But there was clearly an inverted U pattern. If you take the averages of this, it is an inverted U pattern. So if monetary policy does not respond to this particular price pressure coming from vegetables, we know that after 12 months, inflation is not going to increase much. But yes, if the price index for food is going to increase substantially, the way it happened last year, and now also the way the vegetable price index is behaving relative to its past pattern, then there is something very different from the earlier years when um, um, help possibly in achieving in the past efficiency in particular, the inflation target was achieved. I have a table going into individual years, what is the amount of inflation that came from food. But these are the two aspects. One is this is a structural phenomenon, and this one which appears to be a change in pattern. So that is why how monetary policy responds to vegetable price shock or food price shock, uh, if we depend on our empirical work for the past, it may give you information only up to this period. But now that the pattern for 2023, 24 and 24, 25, they appear to be a little different, then our assessment of transmission of supply shock, we have to be a little more guarded also here. So this is taken from the report on currency and finance when the review of the target was done. So what it tells is that the key aspect in FIT to deal with food shocks is the flexibility part, which is the target band, because many of the countries have a high share of food in their consumption basket. So this here they have presented countries where the food share is higher than 30%, and here are the countries where the food share is less than 30%, but still above 15%. So what is the standard way to deal with food shocks? Is to either have the inflation target in terms of a range, that is 4% to 6%, or to have a target with a tolerance band. And what we find here is that none of the countries actually have a tolerance band which is more than 2%. And if you have interest, maybe you will see the particular chapter of that RCF, which explains very clearly why the tolerance band of plus minus 2 is appropriate for India. And one of the arguments they gave in RCF to justify this plus minus 2% is that they studied that whenever inflation deviates from the tolerance band, that means it goes above 6% or it drops below 2%, the headline inflation has remained in the post FID period 88% of the time within the tolerance band. And this is a surprising feat because this has happened at a time when food and beverages, almost 57% of the time, actually monthly food inflation has not remained within the tolerance band. And if we take vegetables, almost 85% of the time, the vegetable inflation has not remained within the tolerance band. So what I'm saying here is that this band is set in such a nice way that even if you get vegetable stock where 85% of the time it does not remain within the tolerance band, an entire food basket that does not remain within the tolerance band almost 57% of the time, but still the headline inflation remains within the tolerance band almost 81, 88% of the time. So what it tells is that it's only the remaining 12% in terms of the time part. So if it deviates in a month outside the tolerance band, how long it takes to come back to the tolerance band? And that is also an important aspect which must be examined when we talk about how inflation should respond to relative price shocks. So I'm using here two or three excellent research work coming out from RBI, most of them with Dr. Patra as the main author and his team. So what the left-hand side table shows is the contribution of supply shocks to food inflation. So this is the part actually which refers to which we could say that the period from 14-15 and 15-16, when the inflation target was adopted through an agreement first before the act was amended. It was a glide path approach, and then the formal adoption happened. And 16 to 20, if we see, that is the first MPC period. And during this transitional phase and also the first MPC period, actually most of the supply shocks were favorable. As a result of which, the first MPC, the average inflation was slightly less than 4%. But what has happened for the MPC, whose term maybe is ending in October, is that they got a massive supply shock in 2023-24. So what one has to understand from this is that one MPC may be lucky here compared to the other MPC, but it is important to have a robust framework to deliver on price stability, irrespective of the nature of supply shocks. Whether you get favorable supply shocks because of which your inflation is achieved, or you get adverse supply shocks because of which you still try to keep the inflation in the medium run within the tolerance band. So the focus essentially is on the framework, and when the flexible inflation targeting was set, I think now that after 8 years we are having this information, it tells us that how nicely the framework was set. So as a framework, it is not only telling why the inflation was achieved that time and inflation target was achieved that time, and also despite massive shocks and repeated supply shocks, the inflation deviation has been managed very well because the framework essentially provides that strong support to the MPC for conducting monetary policy. The second argument which is presented in this article is that there is always transmission of food shocks to inflation expectations, and an essential feature of inflation targeting framework, which is very different from any other inflation targeting and any other monetary policy framework, is anchoring of inflation expectations. So if we see the right-hand side estimation they have given, the household inflation expectations increase when food inflation increase. But by raising the repo rate, actually it is counteracting the inflationary impact of food inflation. So what it tells is that the second round impact of food inflation on core inflation through inflation expectation is a reality, and that provides justification for why must respond to such inflationary pressures. The left-hand side chart is taken from another article by Dr. Patra and his team. Are food prices spilling over? So this gives a decomposition of core inflation. So core inflation, the blue part is the underlying part, or which you can say is very close to trend inflation. But if we see different policy shocks and also supply shocks, how they have contributed to core inflation, the yellow part is essentially all shocks excluding food. The red part is the food shock, and the green part is the demand shock or maybe monetary policy shock. So what it tells very clearly that largely showed for the 11 advanced country central bank, the type of shocks, supply shocks, whether it is supply chain disruption or maybe commodity prices going up, food prices going up temporarily globally. So all those shocks have dissipated. And even for India, we find that the impact of those shocks impacting core inflation is much less now. And in the first quarter of 2024-25, the yellow part is almost negligible or it has returned negative. That means it is supporting basically moderation in core inflation. But what is rising is the red part. That means food shock is still spilling over to core inflation. And as I showed in the previous slide, the monetary policy is essentially counteracting. That means it is offsetting this part by keeping the interest rate at 6.5%. So how monetary policy should respond to then the shocks? You know, the red part is shock coming from food, and the yellow part is coming in terms of shocks from other sources. So if it is one-time shock, as I explained, monetary policy need not respond. Within 12 months, inflation will come down to the target. But if we get shocks which are large and persistent, then this is again taken from another article. Um, um, what it says is that the blue path is if monetary policy is not responding, then inflation will be much higher and growth sacrifice will be much less. But because that the inflation shock coming from the side of food is more persistent, and the monetary policy responds by raising the interest rate, then certainly inflation path is much lower compared to the blue path, but it involves larger growth sacrifice. So that is why this is a difficult call in terms of when to act and then how much growth to sacrifice. And the policy framework as of now, in terms of the flexibility in FIT, provides uh, considerable option essentially to take a call on how to interpret this and when to respond. So another piece of research again coming from RBI is that if we see different items in the consumption basket, so each item is subjected to both supply side pressure and demand side pressure. The way they have defined the demand side pressure and supply side information, you could refer to either the article or maybe right hand side in simple language taken from the article I have presented. So what you find here is that in case of vegetable, clearly this part shows that it is a supply shock. But there are other items like maybe fruits, maybe milk, eggs, meat and fish. The blue part, which is the demand component, demand also matters in shaping the path of food inflation. So it would not be proper to always conclude that food inflation we get only because of adverse supply shocks. So the second argument has been that monetary policy is not effective. Yes, when monetary policy is effective or not um, over the 12-month period when you are dealing with only food supply shock is very different from whether monetary policy is effective when food inflation has actually started impacting the core inflation trajectory. So here if we see, this is taken from the annual report of RBI that if there is a policy response of 100 basis points, then clearly growth sacrifice is there. and inflation also moderates. So in the post-COVID period, the total cumulative increase in policy repo rate has been 250 basis points. So if the increase in policy rate was zero, then the inflation trajectory what we get today would have been higher by maybe 100 basis points or 90 basis points. But because of the 250 basis point cumulative interest rate action, the decline in inflation is around 60 basis points. So if you add this, 50 basis point and 90 basis point, then almost 140 basis point of the decline in inflation that we get today is because of monetary policy. So what are the lessons in terms of FIT for the future? So this is a very important piece of research for interpreting FIT, uh, uh, both maybe in advanced economies and in emerging market economies, because advanced economies, they won't operate, most of them, with a tolerance band. Emerging market economies operate with a tolerance band. But even for countries which have point targets, maybe they need more flexibility. So three important findings here, if we see that this is the distribution of inflation. So what we find is that there are many relative price shocks which are essentially driving the inflation trajectory. This is the median. You take any item from the consumption basket. This is the median path, how it has increased over time. So when the median path has increased to 180, there are many items in the food basket in the US which have increased at a much slower pace and which have increased at a much faster pace. So this essentially tells that the relative price changes are more frequent compared to what maybe any inflation targeting framework would assume or would like it to be. The middle part is telling that because of this change in the inflation dynamics, if you take all different determinants of inflation and look for the principal component, that is the first principal component which explains what part of inflation, then the explanatory power of the first principal component is consistently declining. So it essentially tells about weakening efficacy of monetary policy in delivering price stability. So this is suggesting a different type of flexibility. This also is suggesting a different type of flexibility in the conduct of monetary policy. And this particular chart is telling that over a period of 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, and 48 months, the first uh, uh, impact, which operates basically, I'm not going here into the different transmission channels that I've discussed, but what proportion of inflation is actually tamed because of monetary policy. So what it finds that even after 36 months, only 30% of the inflation pressure will be managed by inflation. And if you weight it by the expenditure shares in personal consumption expenditure, it is even lower. So what are the three key messages coming out from this slide? This is taken from Claudio Borio and his co-authors. They are very nice article. Sector-specific price changes across sectors, rather than generalized price co-movements, account for most of the fluctuations in aggregate price indices. I talked about the problem with the title of my presentation, that food price inflation, because inflation is generally used when we talk of generalized price pressures. But in reality, what we find is that sector-specific price changes are dominating, and the common principal component or one component which can explain a major part of the inflationary pressures, uh, that weight is dipping over time. So this evidence puts a premium on flexibility in pursuing inflation targets within a credible policy regime. The importance of a degree of tolerance for deviations of inflation from targets within certain ranges and of longer horizons to bring inflation back within those ranges. So coming to the key takeaways, a cost of living index must cover all consumption expenses, can be approximated by headline inflation, not core inflation, because what we recently faced globally is the cost of index or cost of living crisis. And cost of living means it covers the entire consumption basket. It doesn't cover only the core items. While headline inflation as a target may require supply side measures for achieving price stability, thereby interfering with market dynamics of farm products, core inflation as a target may pose even greater complications for all markets. For example, exchange rate. How would you know what is the fair value of the exchange rate? How do you construct the NER and RER if you are having core inflation as the target? What will happen to assessment of many economic agents in the capital markets? How savers would know what is the real rate of return they are going to get on savings if the inflation target is only core? How many of the firms would be discounting the future cash flows? They have to use a discount rate. Whether they will be linking the discount rate to core inflation, given the uncertainty about food inflation and who will manage food inflation. Excuse me. And the complications also it will pose for the real economy because of lack of clarity on who would stabilize food inflation. And as a result, how could monetary policy work amid higher risks of second round transmission to core inflation? Relative price shocks, when they persist, send signals for warranted resource reallocation in the economy. So this is a real sector problem. It should not be essentially seen as a problem for monetary policy. So productivity and climate resilience of the farm sector should be the policy focus. As rightly announced, several measures have been announced for the agriculture sector. So that is the right way to essentially deal with the relative price shocks or the lingering structural problems we may have in the farm sector, rather than removing food from the inflation target. Because as I shared, the post-COVID experience globally shows that the science part of the framework has worked. It is only about the flexibility part. So how exactly the flexibility part has to be interpreted, reviewed, debated, that's a different issue altogether. It is also important to have the clarity that monetary policy accommodation of supply shocks makes inflation eventually a monetary phenomenon in the medium run. Because as I said, now the money supply process is endogenous. So whenever the demand for money warrants injection of supply of money or supply of liquidity, given the repo rate, this will automatically get accommodated. Monetary policy does not respond to transitory supply shock. As I said, if your inflation rises and dissipates, the supply shock dissipates over 12 months period, monetary policy did not respond to that. So no obvious costs of FIT, because if the supply shock is transitory, FIT framework does not essentially tell us that monetary policy must respond to that shock. So there is no growth sacrifice involved here. In the medium run, monetary policy aims at minimizing costs. So it is a choice, as I showed you the trade-off in different slides, because it has to recognize the potential higher costs of a hands-off approach or delayed withdrawal of accommodation. Because if you delay it too much and if you act too little, then the risk of allowing inflation to persist for longer with higher growth sacrifice that increases. And that exactly was the experience just before the adoption of FIT, because inflation remained close to double digits for more than 5 years. So when inflation remains above 5%, despite the nature of the shock for 5 years, that clearly tells us that it is a monetary phenomenon, even though the origin of the shock might have been a supply shock. If in India's FIT, that is plus minus 2%, minimizes the potential costs of using a headline inflation as the target, the 4% target is critical to anchor inflation expectations. And once we anchor inflation expectations, the advantage of that is that we have to respond much less to accommodate supply shock. Because if inflation expectations are not anchored, you have to respond possibly at some stage to supply shock. But if inflation expectations are anchored, then that also further increases the flexibility for monetary policy to accommodate supply shock. Supply shock induced deviations usually return to within the 4 plus minus 2% tolerance band, most of the time within 1 year. I had one of the charts from the RCF which shows that much of the supply shocks in the past have actually dissipated maybe within 12 months. But taking the example from the chart I presented from the article by Bernanke and Olivier Blanchard, that maybe the path, the time frame over which supply shocks could come back to the tolerance band, that might have changed. And that is why that needs to be assessed periodically, maybe more frequently. Uh, and in terms of international experience, we know that most of the countries have headline inflation as the target. Thailand is the only country which experimented with core inflation as the target. But I think after 4 or 5 years, it has come back to headline inflation as the target. And currently, maybe Uganda is the only country which is experimenting with core inflation as the target. But they have made it very clear that it is a transitional arrangement. And so they have adopted core inflation as part of the target. So there are exceptions like Thailand and Uganda, but the international experience clearly tells us that headline inflation sets the nominal anchor for monetary policy, and all the other countries which have adopted inflation targeting, headline inflation is the target. Need for institutionalizing greater flexibility in FIT in the future. These are some of the issues which have been discussed in the past and being discussed again now. So there is nothing wrong with the framework. It is essentially a question of integrating more flexibility into the framework. So one option there which is being debated is to extend the period of defining failure of MPC for inflation deviations to 4 consecutive quarters from 3 consecutive quarters. Uh, uh, Second one is to raise the term of MPC to 5 years instead of 4 years, where, as I said, only maybe less than 40% of the inflation episode could be contained within 4 years. So maybe the term of the MPC should be increased by 1 more year instead of the current 4 years. And importantly, highlight in every policy resolution the needed farm sector structural reforms that could improve supply response to relative price shocks and reduce the probability or magnitude of second round spillovers to core inflation. This is essentially about appropriate resource reallocation in the economy, resources moving to the farm sector where productivity must go up, and also it must be much more resilient to climate shocks. So if not much progress happens on that front, then the challenges that we faced in maybe last 2 3 years because of supply shocks impacting our headline trajectory, they will persist. But I think this has been the path followed by other countries. Resources have moved timely and in adequate manner to the farm sector, and that's why yields have gone up. And very few countries actually get such um, episodes of food inflation persisting beyond maybe 12 months or 18 months. Inflation forecast targeting in the presence of supply shocks. This is again in terms of future ideas coming from recent article by Marvin King, 2024. Inflation forecast targeting in the presence of supply shocks. There are 3 or 4 important issues here. Recognize that the central forecast is not precise. It is impossible for anyone to give a forecast path which could be precise. And across central banks, actually, the deviation from a forecast path has been substantial. So, in the actual conduct of policy, much flexibility must be there, and that will be possible when they recognize that the central path is only a path which need not guide entirely the conduct of policy going ahead. Reduce groupthink because whenever the inflation target is set, um, um, I'll take a minute and I'll close. Okay. So I'll read it. Reduce groupthink, recognize risk to using models that assume total credibility of the central bank and dangers of forward guidance, and more regular reset of the CPI basket to reflect the recent consumption pattern. To conclude with the quote from Borio, just like a credible conductor of a well rehearsed orchestra can afford to lead with minimal gestures, so a credible central bank can afford to let inflation evolve within a wider range of its target without energetic adjustments to the policy stance. I stop here. Thank you. I exceeded my time by almost 15-20 minutes. So maybe I wanted to cover all the slides. Thank you. Over to you.
No issue at all. Actually, it was a very enlightening lecture and dealt with all the issues in so great details. So I'm sure actually it must have helped all our participants to understand the detailed issues actually what all dimensions. So thank you so much actually, for this very good lecture. So I think we can now open the floor for discussion. Maybe you can now close your presentation. So we can take up questions from the participants. Yes, so whoever wants to ask questions can raise hand so that we can go in the order. Yes, so Professor Barendra Kumar Bhoi. So
So,
going good.
good evening to everybody. Thank you, Mr. Patnaik, Dr. Patnaik, for a very excellent presentation. This professionalism is very much high, no doubt about it. We know about this. Now the debate is somewhat, complicated because, uh, food prices is a supply side problem. Everybody knows. There is no doubt about it. Supply side problem, everybody know the supply side problem, but the persistent food prices, that is also people are arguing the persistent food prices we cannot be able to tolerate beyond 3-4 quarters. Now there is also a problem spillover from food prices to this headline inflation. That is debatable. Why it is debatable? If you see our core inflation has come down before your CPI inflation has come down. CPI inflation was high, core inflation has come down. If food inflation is spilling over to core inflation, it would not have come down. Now food inflation has come down, core inflation started inching up. So spillover is definitely there. We cannot say deny there is no spillover. But spillover, the way we are telling, defending that because of this spillover, second round effect, we cannot ignore, is not the issue. Issue is core inflation is not the parameter to be targeted. Except one or two countries, we have to definitely target the headline inflation. Core inflation is not the parameter to be, because the credibility of monetary policy. Now, you have acknowledged also, food inflation is a structural problem. If you see last several years, except last year or so, food grain production was at a record level. And India is the second largest producer of vegetable after China. But, terms of trade is in favor of agricultural commodity. Still, allocation of resources is not taking place in favor of agriculture. So what we are measuring is consumer price inflation, consumer price. It is not going to the farmers because the distribution system is exploitative. It is exploiting consumer, it is exploiting the farmers also. Since farmers are not getting, naturally allocation will not be there. So allocation is a structural problem. Therefore, government wanted to do some structural reform. They could not be able to pursue. So factor market reform, product market reform, these things are really very much necessary to think in terms of increasing production with increasing productivity. The farmers are also not getting the margin. When they are not getting margin, they are not allocating resources, and probably second largest producer of vegetable will not do. We are the largest or the most populated country in the world. We have to produce more vegetables. We have to produce more cereals and pulses and oil seeds. Therefore, what is necessary? The terms of trade should benefit the farmer. Structural reform is necessary. That is the enduring solution. We are trying to use monetary policy as the first line of defense to solve the supply side problem. Because after some time, Yes, we have to have credibility of monetary policy. After some time, if you are persisting with a high interest rate, definitely your growth will suffer. There is no doubt about it. And my compliment for the very erudite presentation. You all agree that it is highly professional presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bhoi. I think all your observations as the former head of MPD, you know the practical aspects much better than me. But what I presented today is not about policy, but about the framework. And what I'm saying is that FIT is the right framework because it has taken into account whatever because advantage of India was that we were a latecomer in addressing inflation targeting. So the experience of a large number of inflation targeting countries was available to us, and India essentially delayed adoption of inflation targeting because of two problems. One was high share of food, and the second was fiscal dominance. But I think inspiration that time was that the wave capital account convertibility didn't wait for all the preconditions to be achieved first, because you start capital account convertibility and then preconditions will be achieved over a period of time. I think that was the spirit when maybe inflation targeting framework was adopted. Over time, it was clearly expected that as it has happened in many other large emerging market economies and almost all advanced economies, that in a market economy, relative price shocks will essentially give rise to resource reallocation, as a result of which supply response will not complicate things for monetary policy. So here, the structural problems in the farm sector, they persist. And even after 8 years of adoption of inflation targeting framework, we are still debating whether this type of reforms which must happen in agriculture will become a major constraint to inflation targeting framework going ahead. Because inflation targeting framework, when it talks about price stability, it is essentially about the key anchor for the macroeconomy. The entire macroeconomic stability debate which is going on in India, a major driver of that has been the price stability that RBI has delivered. First MPC, it was maybe little more supported by positive, favorable supply shocks. So, as you rightly mentioned, any institutional reform like inflation targeting framework needs the support of other reforms. But in the absence of those reforms, assuming that those reforms are not likely to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, because that the share of food will remain high, so the same objective could be achieved by incorporating more flexibility into the framework without sacrificing the anchor. That's what only the essence of what I presented today, and that is also coming out very clearly from the literature in the recent years. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. So now we can take the next question by Dr. Sarath Kumar Malik. Dr. Malik, you can unmute and ask a question.
Yes, I have unmuted. Thank you. I must congratulate Sitikant for making an excellent presentation, and I'm sure that this will be very useful for those who have participated in it, in the discussion, as well as when you put it in the in the YouTube. So definitely it will have a lot of interest for the people. So Sitikant, I know that he is a very knowledgeable person, and also he's a very hard worker, and he has name in RBI. All the top bosses in RBI liked his opinion and views, and also his work. So I will just shift from the central banking to the securities market, just to have something different, because I know that it's a good one that the investment targeting or spoke about the macroeconomics and how the monetary policy committee takes into account the entire thing. So my point is that my one question is, I'm not sure. Maybe I just very curiously I'm asking. So you see, in the recent years or recent times, let's say, recent times, this stock market is booming like anything. Okay, the total market capitalization has increased. So people are making money, and the investors are making money. So when you say that inflation, you relate to some extent that is a monetary phenomenon. So how does it gets a place in the monetary policy committee and the discussions? So very simply, I just want to know this thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. I think when we met recently also, we discussed about this issue. Uh, and you are an expert on the subject, but I'll try to basically relate it to how in the literature on monetary policy, this is viewed. Because when you talk of MVPT, T is essentially about transactions. But what we use as proxy of T is the output. But when we are having a financial system where every financial transaction involves demand for money, so naturally when the financial system is growing and different financial instruments are being bought and sold, that also is generating demand for money or demand for liquidity. And it is because of financial innovations, as we all know, the relationship between that MP and PT, it was very difficult to decipher. And that prompted many central banks to switch over to interest rate. Does that mean that central bank does not take into account what happens to asset prices? The implications of asset prices are clearly factored in the inflation projections and growth projections, because the wealth effect of high asset prices, that can essentially be a demand shock, and similarly that can also alter the domestic financial conditions, because in the assessment of monetary policy transmission, what happens to the financial conditions also you have to closely monitor and understand. So in the assessment of your growth outlook and in the assessment of your monetary policy transmission, the asset prices are clearly factored in. And because of those key channels, that means you are incorporated in the growth assessment, also in the assessment of the monetary policy transmission. What are the implications for inflation, whether through the demand channel or over what time frame inflation will be impacted in the transmission channel? That also is studied. But the international experience again suggests, again theoretical and empirical literature, that there is very little support for monetary policy responding directly to asset prices. Because if asset prices are rising by maybe 10%, 20%, 30%, the magnitude of the increase in monetary policy rate that will be required to tame that asset price inflation could be substantial. So the associated growth sacrifice will be large, and we discussed about the uncertainty about how monetary policy, when it responds to second round effect of food shocks, can create complications for assessment of growth sacrifice. So once you start responding to asset prices directly, that issue will become even more complex. So that is the reason why possibly there is no support for responding to um, um, the asset prices directly. But the asset price implications are clearly factored in the monetary policy framework very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Setival.
So, Basanti, would you like to ask the question? Otherwise, Dr. Sillu Modali.
Namaskar, sir. Uh, uh, actually,
Namaste, Namaste, Silu.
has, sir, actually, let me tell to the platform that Situ sir was my senior boss in RBI, but actually he was not a boss, and he was more like your friend. Today, even in the office, we miss him. And also, sir, today actually I met one of the interns, Somajit, who was working with us. and he was also asking me about ki, how is Siti sir. So and I mean say hi from my side. He was also telling the way actually Siti sir is actually working. The working style of sir was very professional as well as friendly, and today also we get a lot of inspiration for him from him the way he was working for this in central banking. So, sir, today actually I would actually ask one question that the debate has started on this stripping out this food inflation from that. So, one is about the credibility of the central bank. First thing. So once we set that, for example, imagine a situation when core inflation is lower, and I mean within the target, and food inflation is very high. So at that time, when the country is facing high inflation, but still you are communicating from the RBI policy side or from central bank that still inflation is low, and accordingly we will frame the policy. So that will also affect the credibility of the central bank. I think so. And but in another way, that suppose we fail very frequently in managing the inflation within the band, then that is also a risk from the point of view of the credibility. So there are two risks. If we adopt core, we may accountable to the central government or through the law that yes, we are our inflation is within the target, but we will lose the credibility. Number one. Second option is we will stick to the inflation target with some institutional frame changes or something like that, and we may fail. So so there are two. If we fail, then there is also a risk that we will also lose the credibility. I just want to hear the views from you, sir.
Thank you, Silu. Silu has been my co-author, and you always learn the best things in professional life from your co-author. So the question that he has asked actually is from inflation expectations anchoring to credibility of monetary policy. Um, how essentially the target, whether headline or core, will impact credibility of monetary policy is a very important issue. The first thing which will happen is that once you adopt core inflation as the target, it has to be a hard inflation targeting, because your entire flexibility in FIT is coming because that you are also taking the responsibility of responding to the second round effects of food inflation. So with much less flexibility, if you face a situation like demonetization or what happened after COVID, where the monetary policy responds primarily through liquidity rather than by changing the rate, so that will become even more complicated. So your ability to respond to massive shocks, which are not essentially food shocks, that will go down drastically the moment you switch to only core inflation as the target. Second thing is that anchoring of inflation expectations will become even more difficult because there will be a complete lack of clarity in the market as to who is managing food inflation. Because if there is another framework which is backing the inflation targeting framework with core inflation as the target, then maybe the complementarity between the two, that will help in entrenching credibility. But if there is no other framework with assurance and transparency on how the food inflation part is going to be managed, if that part is open and you are having an inflation targeting framework where the target is only core, it's what natural that very few people will take it as an anchor. A saver will not believe in that. An investor will not believe in that. No market entity will take an investment position based on core inflation as its assessment of how basically the discounting has to be done, whether in terms of return from financial assets or return from real assets. So the anchoring nature of the target itself will go down drastically the moment we remove food from the target and the share of food remains high. And everybody knows that the share of food in the basket is not going to drop below 30% even in the next 10 years. So I have a feeling that even if we have a parallel framework, giving clarity on how exactly the food inflation will be stabilized, still possibly the anchoring aspect of the inflation target will face credibility issues. So that is why maybe the macroeconomic stability which has been delivered through this FIT, irrespective of occasional deviations from the tolerance band, that benefit will be lost. And once that benefit is lost, I'm sure the inflation and growth mix will be much more adverse compared to the growth and inflation mix we have delivered under the inflation targeting review. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we should close because actually Dr. Patnaik actually has another engagements after after 5 o'clock. So I think now I'll request the President of Odisha Economic Association, Professor Abhinaran Patra, to give his concluding remarks.
I think you will all agree with me that Dr. Patnaik has presented a meticulously prepared, incisive, and wonderful lecture. And it is no less than a serious classroom lecture in class on monetary economics. I am reminded of three things. Dr. Patnaik spoke for about 1 hour, and our MA classes were of 1 hour duration. And I am also reminded of my honors class, my teacher, when he started teaching us inflation. He said the very sentence which I am quoting verbatim, that next to war and pestilence, inflation is the greatest calamity that can befall on mankind. Of course, there are other calamities now, like climate change and all that, but that is the case. The third thing is that when I started teaching macroeconomics, I was teaching that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So all these things were curiously and very meticulously combined in Dr. Patnaik's lecture. And he was very thorough in saying that the RBI is a flexible inflation targeter, and it is more effective in making the monetary policy transmission. And the third thing is that it is non-discretionary. The inflation targeting is non-discretionary. But what is more important is that the food inflation that we see nowadays, it is contributed largely by weather conditions, by the fuel price, the transportation. We are talking in just before the lecture that we consume the tomatoes in the rural areas that are coming from Bangalore. The large amount of say transport cost is involved. That is why nowadays the inflation in rural areas is higher than the inflation in the urban areas in some cases. That is what is the case. And supply chain disruptions are also there. I am very much thankful to Dr. Patnaik for having ended his lecture with a very humorous note, comparing the central banker with a conductor of a very meticulously prepared orchestra. Thank you, Dr. Patnaik. Thank you, Silu, for having coordinated, having facilitated, and I thank all the participants. I will now request Dr. Amarendra to present a formal vote of thanks and declare the meeting closed.
No, actually, yeah, so thank you so much, Professor Patnaik, for sparing your time and preparing in such a certain way. And of course, it is good to know actually from a person who was part of such analysis and decision making. Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Patnaik and Dr. Silu, for all these facilities. So, and also the participants who spend their time on Sunday afternoon. Okay, so thank you so much. I think with this we can conclude.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patient hearing. And I think it was wonderful to join, maybe share with you whatever little I know. So I'm sure in future also there will be many more such interactive sessions, and I'll try to join and benefit from maybe some very enriching discussions that we are having in this forum. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. ପୁରୁଷୋତ୍ତମଙ୍କ ନମ୍ବର ଆମ ଇଏରେ ଏଣ୍ଟ୍ରି ହେଇଥିଲା ଆମର ଅନ୍ ଅଛି।